In the previous lecture, we started learning SAML, and we'll learn how we can define an entry and a button inside of the UI, and how we can create an event handler by assigning it to an event. In the case of a button, the clicked event. We also define the bunch of code that is going to be the event handler, with the same name that we set inside of SAML. This bunch of code is the one that is going to be executed every time the user clicks on a button. And it's in here where we want to add the functionality of getting the value that is inside of the entry and assigning some value to the label. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing that we have to keep in mind is that in order to be able to access these elements, they have to be named. And currently they are not. This means that they do exist in the user interface, but we do not have access to them from the C# file. So the first thing that we have to do is add a name. To be able to add a name, let's write down right before the setting of the first property, x:\name. And we're going to assign it to the name that we want to set. I do want to take a couple of seconds to let you know that naming convention is very important in this case. My naming convention usually is writing down whatever the element is about and then writing down the name of the element or the type of the element. For example, this label that is going to display a greeting to the user, I can call it greeting. And because it is a label, I can call it label as well. So it ends up being named greeting label. This way, I know what this label is about, and I also know that it is a label indeed. This is especially important when you have more and more elements inside of your user interface. For example, if this entry needed to be called greeting as well, I could identify the difference between the label and the entry because one would be called greeting label and the other greeting entry. But in this case, the entry is going to have a different name. So let's go ahead and set the name again by x:\name and assigning it to the value. In this case, since the entry is going to allow the user to write down a name, I am going to name the entry name entry. Very straightforward, but it's important for you to have established naming convention so it's easier for you to work with the elements that you define. We only need to name these both elements because we do not need to change anything from a button or to get anything from a button. The only thing that we need from the button is to know when it is pressed, and that is being covered by the clicked event. So now we can return to the main page, and inside of that bunch of code that we define to be the event handler, we can assign the value to the greeting. And the name of the label that we have is precisely greeting label. And notice that because I have already named the element from SAML, as soon as I start writing its name, it appears in a list. And so all I have to do is type enter or tab on my keyboard to be able to access it. And then what I want to do is set the value for its text property. The same properties that we have access from SAML, we have access from C#. So if I wanted to change the value that is being displayed, to change it from welcome to Xamarin Forms to, for example, welcome Eduardo, I have to change the value that is assigned to the text property. To access that property, all I have to do is type dot and start writing text. And notice that it also appears in a list. All I have to do is type enter or tab on my keyboard and then assign it to some value. And in the case of the text, we need to assign this to a string. A string is a value that has some text on it. And that is exactly what we want to set to the text property, some text. In here, I will just set it to welcome. But we also want to welcome the user and personalize this to whatever the user has written down inside of the box, which remember is called name entry. How do we get that? Well, just like the label, it has a text property. So just like we are assigning some value, we can get the value. So what we can do in here is add something else to the value that we are assigning to the text. This also has to be a string. So we can get the name entry. Notice that it is also listed. So I only need to start typing it and find it on the list and then type enter. And then the name entry has a text property. What we're doing here is getting whatever is written down inside of the entry and adding it to this welcome text. By the way, we'll need a space in here So we have a space between welcome and whatever the user wrote down inside of the text. And then this is joined together and then assigned to the text that is inside of the greeting label. Notice how we are accessing the elements. We first needed to name the elements. And then, once having named them, we can access them from C#. And just like on SAML, we have access to their properties. And we have access to their properties both to set a value to them or to get a value from them. In this case, we're doing both. We're assigning a value to the text property by placing it to the left of an equal sign. In this case, the value to the right has two elements. First, a string that we define directly, and then a string that we are getting directly from a property inside of the entry. By adding this plus sign between the elements, we are joining the two values together into one single string, and that string is being assigned to the text of the label. And that's it. We already have the design and the basic functionality for our application. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how to use the Xamarin Live Player to start testing our application. And we're going to identify if both the user interface and the functionality are correct, or if we need to change it a little bit.